Good morning.
Good morning.
So this morning, we are doing the last of the 10 Oxfording pictures, which is often called returning to the marketplace. And if you look at the pictures here, you can see the last one, number 10. It's kind of chubby monk addressing a young person who represents, as you can see, looks exactly like the person in Oxfording picture 1. So this is a person who's starting out on the Buddhist path. So he's advising him and helping him. Okay, the verse that goes along with this is bare-chested and barefooted he enters the market. So we're talking about this older figure here. Face streaked with dust and head covered with ash, but a mighty laugh spreads from cheek to cheek. Without troubling himself to work miracles, suddenly dead trees break into bloom. So that's the verse that goes along with this. So I think the only line here that is somewhat enigmatic is the part where it says, without troubling himself to work miracles, suddenly dead trees break into bloom. So this older monk here, he just isn't worried about doing anything special. He does what he does without effort. He does it without fanfare. And he wakes up the aspiration for practice, the aspiration for realization through his actions. So people see him and they say, hey, I want to be like this guy. And that encourages them to practice. Now, practicing the Bodhisattva way now, the metaphor of the dead tree in Chinese and in Zen is a little more difficult. It usually often refers to practitioners who are in these kind of jhana states of meditation. And those kind of states of meditation are not shikantaza. They're where you're unaware of your surroundings, you're having special experiences, etc. So that is considered to be dead tree meditation. Whether or not that's what's going on here, I doubt it. I think probably it's more like saying something, the second meaning of this, which is that your practice is like it's dead. You're like this dead tree with no leaves on it, like kind of a hollowed out trunk. So he's waking up this aspiration for enlightenment. He's showing through his actions a path that encourages people to want to practice and to enter into practice. So the name of this picture is often called Returning to the Marketplace with Gift Bestowing Hands. When I was at San Francisco Zen Center, they had a ceremony for people who had been residents at Zen Center and decided to leave and go off and get a job doing something else or whatever. And there was a ceremony that was called, Returning to the Marketplace with Gift Bestowing Hands. And so the first thing I thought I would do is actually talk about this monk before I start talking about Bodhisattva practice. So this monk is a real person, supposedly a real person who lived in China. And his name in Chinese is Shinshu, and in Japanese it's Hotai. So, at our local Chinese restaurant here down in Canton restaurant down the street, they have this huge laughing Buddha, Hotai Buddha, that's on the front desk there. And he's got coins, and now I notice there's more and more dollar bills being stuffed into nooks and crannies of his body, and somebody took some coins and stacked it up on the top of his head. So we see Hotai around a lot. We see these statues of Hotai, the kind of laughing Buddha with a big stomach. And Hotai is the older practitioner here in the 10th picture. And so kind of like, he's also called, as I mentioned, the laughing Buddha. His image is associated with happiness, good fortune, good luck, and abundance, which is why we see him in the altars, and at the Chinese restaurants. So it's kind of cool because this Buddha, this monk, Hotai, who's known for this ordinary practice, has survived to this day in this kind of ordinary way for us that we think is kind of kitschy, actually. But it's this ordinary life of Hotai that still exists out there in the world. So it's kind of cool. So he doesn't look like most Buddhas. We usually think of the Buddha looking more like the Buddha here on the altar, Shakyamuni Buddha, but Hotai is a Buddha, and Hotai is very much grounded in this everyday life, and that's the Buddha practice as well. So it was thought that Hotai lived in the 10th century in China. His biography first appeared in the 13th century in a Chinese collection of stories about eminent practitioners called Legends of High Priests of the Song Dynasty. So that's where we get these stories. He was an eccentric guy. He wandered around. He carried this big bag, which you can see here on his back in this picture. He had this big bag that he carried around, and supposedly, no, it's unclear exactly what was in the bag, but just stuff that he collected. And also, he's known for giving candy to kids and toys and playing with little kids, and kind of just generally having a sort of loose, unmonastic lifestyle. And then there was a stele. Well, his bag is called budai, which means cloth sack or bag. So it doesn't refer to Buddha. And he was innocent, sincere, and had a generous spirit. So there was a stele from the Jin dynasty in China, which is 12th to mid 13th century. And they describe him like this. They say, Budai's leather bag contains the world of the Dharma. He strolls through heavens and hells. He follows his destiny, rubbing shoulders with butchers, wine sellers, and prostitutes. Shouldering his staff, he begs everywhere and receives what he needs. Pitying the people of his time, he has not yet chosen to return from the darkness of this world to see to heaven. To see to heaven is where Shakyamuni Buddha hung out after his last rebirth as an arhat, and then came back and as a Buddha from to see to heaven. He was actually a Buddha in to see to heaven. Anyway, but Hotai stays in the midst of the confusion in the stalls and the shouting of the marketplace. So if you know Vimalakirti, he kind of reminds us of Vimalakirti, but Vimalakirti in the Vimalakirti Sutra was clearly of an upper class aspect. He was clearly separate from the people around him, and Hotai is not. So then over time, he became part of what's called the 7 gods of good fortune. And they have a ship that they're in. I bet you're familiar with this. No, the 7 gods of good fortune. And maybe it says here that this is of Japanese origin. And I always associate it with Chinese. And so you'll see a big ship with the 7 gods of good fortune in the ship. And Hotai became part of those 7 gods. I don't know how he ended up being in these kind of in this Chinese restaurant iteration where he's the god of good fortune and all of this, but that's part of these 7 gods of good fortune. And in Japan, there's a bunch of stories and myths and things associated with him, but one of them is that at night on New Year's Eve, he travels in a ship with these other gods of good fortune and brings happiness to believers at every port. So even though they actually take on bodily form on New Year's Eve, and they go to different ports in Japan, and they spread goodwill. Did you ever hear these stories?
No, but I know what the 7 gods. I thought he was one of the 7 gods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, it's kind of interesting. Look him up on Google. You'll find stuff about Hotai. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on in the 10th picture. So, Hotai is a manifestation of Bodhisattva practice. And we talked earlier, Keegan had brought up the fact last week that these pictures originally stopped at picture number 8. And then later, a Chinese monk added 9 and 10 to round out this practice, this bodhisattva practice, going back to the marketplace, not just stopping here at 8 with this complete realization of emptiness being like the end of the path, because that would kind of indicate that the practitioner did not need to come back in a certain way and relate to, have a responsibility of relationships in their everyday life. You could kind of hang out in the hut there in number 7 and never get beyond that. So number 10 is saying, no, our practice means we have to go back to the marketplace with gift bestowing hands. So
With what it ends?
gift bestowing hands.
Gifts.
Right. So, so as I said, Hotai is the manifestation of bodhisattva practice. So our bodhisattva vow, which we often repeat, is, to paraphrase it, is to help others, benefit others, to work with one's delusions, to enter all practice opportunities that we have, and to follow the Buddha Bodhisattva path in our lives. So that's the Bodhisattva vow. So here we see Hotai offering instruction or help to this young practitioner who's just starting out on this path. And I want to stop for a minute and talk about the difference between the Mahayana and the Theravadan. Or the Theravadan just means schools of the elder, and there were many schools of Theravadan Buddhism. Now there's pretty much one, which is just called Theravadan Buddhism. And then there's the Mahayana, which started around the turn of the first millennium. And Mahayana Buddhism has an emphasis on bodhisattva practice. So what does that mean? In Theravadan Buddhism, the goal is, and still is to get off the wheel of birth and death. And basically the idea is that we live in a Saha world. It's not a pleasant place. It's not a place you want to hang out. And so your whole practice is about getting off this wheel of birth and death and not returning to rebirth. In that context, the bodhisattva practice is, yeah, I want to come back to the wheel of rebirth. And because the bodhisattva, what keeps the Theravadan practitioner attached and being reborn is attachment to various things that suck them into the next rebirth. But for the bodhisattva, it's this attachment to wanting to help all beings, to say, I will not get off the wheel of birth and death until all beings are off the wheel of birth and death. So that means the bodhisattva keeps coming back, especially high-level bodhisattvas have the ability to make these decisions. I think for all of us, probably not so much, but for the, the guys, people, women, men who are in this level, they can say, okay, I'm going to make this decision to come back. So that's kind of in this context. And the reason I want to bring this up is because when we talk about bodhisattva practice, helping others, doing all these things, it doesn't mean that people who are doing the Arhat practice or the Shravaka practice, the Theravadan practice, it doesn't mean that they're not doing that stuff, right? It doesn't mean that they don't care about helping all beings, because they do, right? So we don't have some market on this, altruistic attempts to benefit all beings path, just because we're Mahayana Buddhists. So for example, insight meditation is a Theravadan practice. It's not a Mahayana practice. So they're not trying to be bodhisattvas, but what they are doing is equally efficacious. Okay, so I want to make that point. Okay, so let's just talk about bodhisattva practice here. And bodhisattva practice is a huge topic in Buddhism. You can imagine, if we're talking about the turn of the millennium, the first discussions are real way. I mean, the idea of the bodhisattva practice has been around from the very beginning in Buddhism. But as I've said before, because bodhisattvas turn into Buddhas, and there could only be one Buddha at a time, and that Buddha would only show up after trilocosms of years of whatever, that, passing. That means that very few people could ever become Buddhas. So people did what was very practical, is they became arhats. they did this Theravada practice of becoming arhats, but the Mahayana said, no, actually, everybody can become Buddhas, and there are innumerable millions of multi-universes of Buddha fields that all these Buddhas are in. And so it became this very Baroque vision of the nature of the universe. And at that point, there was lots of Buddha fields that people could become Buddhas in. And so people took up the Bodhisattva path. We don't talk about this so much anymore, usually in how we talk about practice. But that's kind of how the evolution of that came about. Lotus Sutra is big because the Lotus Sutra basically said, I predict that everybody can be a Buddha. And before that, you had to be predicted to be a Buddha by another Buddha, which was tough. Because that means if in order to be predicted to be a Buddha, for example, you would have to be predicted by Shakyamuni Buddha. In our case, I bet none of us, well, we don't know because, and then maybe in another lifetime, we were Buddhas, or we met Shakyamuni Buddha, who knows? I read this really interesting book. I'm going to go a little diversion here. This really interesting book called The Buddha. And it's a series of scholarly essays, kind of in dedication to a guy named John Strong, who was a really well-known Buddhist scholar. And it turned out that the Buddha was born with co-natals. Co-natals are people who are born at the same time. Their rebirth happens at the same time as like a famous figure like Shakyamuni Buddha. So these people who were reborn simultaneously, to use some vernacular, was kind of like his posse. So they would be reborn, they co-natal, they would be reborn, their lifetimes were synced up with his. So they would help him and take certain roles in his life in order to, help manifest that ultimate stage or whatever of this Buddhahood of Shakyamuni. We could be all of us co-natals with each other, right? Have you thought about that? We could all be reborn together in this moment in time, have come together in this rebirth as co-natals with each other for the purpose of supporting each other's bodhisattva practice. That's kind of a wild and crazy idea. Kind of nice, isn't it, to think about that we're born with this in this same time span to help each other. Or maybe our practice and the practice of all bodhisattvas and Buddhas, and I mean that in a very broad term, which is to say everyone who has this aspiration to do beneficial acts in the world, regardless of any kind of religious or non-religious affiliation, we're all co-natals with each other, born into the Saha world at this point in time. So who knows? Could be, Okay, so I want to talk about bodhisattva practice using Dogen's text, the Tenso Gyokun, which is instructions to the cook. And it's a really interesting text. I think the most recent book published version of the book that I like, which is Ucham, not Ucham Roshi. His commentary is that Shahaka put out is called something like some notes from the Zen kitchen or something along those lines. Anyway, I'm sorry that I didn't write that in my notes. So in the Tenso Gyokun, Dogen talks about how the head cook, what their responsibility is in their practice. And this is essentially bodhisattva practice, and we can read this book and say, how does this apply to my own life? So Dogen begins by saying that the head cook is a mature leader. So I think that's something that we all strive for, is to be mature leaders, especially as we get older. I think we go through stages of life, and we hope that we reach a stage of our life as we mature that we actually are giving back. We are gift bestowing hands, as opposed to just kind of taking the whole time. So he says, someone who can help or guide by example, what we do this by example or when asked, unless we're in a position of actively being a teacher or the head cook where you're teaching people in the kitchen, or in my case, as a person who's in a position as a teacher, maybe I might proactively say something. Gigan and Shijun can tell you that I'm always telling them to fix their robes. So, I feel that's my responsibility to do that. But, it doesn't mean that we're meddling with other people's lives and bossing them around. It just means that we try to do our best to quietly be present and to, be an example, which is really hard, I think, to manifest patience, joy, and equanimity, which I think is a really tough bill to fill. And to pay attention to our own lives, in the context of praxis and work with these qualities. So Dogen says, in order to do this practice, you have to have a spirit for it. You have to have a desire to do it. You have to awaken this bodhicitta, this mind of Buddha, and this willing to make this effort, to pay attention to all aspects of our life. And we should pay attention to details. And Tenzo Kyokon, he talks about how the Tenzo pays attention to the details of taking stones out of rice, for example. And he says, you put the high pots high and the low pots low. Well, what does that mean? Probably means you put the bigger pots on the bottom and so that you don't put heavy things on the top shelf, and you put larger pots on the bottom and smaller pots on the top, things like that. And, asking ourselves, well, what does that mean to us? And, he says, if we how do we make this effort, and paying attention to these relationships? So we ask ourselves, what's happening in our garden? What beings live with us in our garden? And how can we help or not do harm? How to relate to clerks at the grocery store when we go to the grocery store. Do you pick up litter? I tell you, this probably gross you out, but when I go to a public bathroom and people have thrown paper towels on the floor, I pick them up and put them in the trash. And I do that because they've done studies that show that when there's paper on the floor, people are more likely to throw paper on the floor. So, maybe that's a little gross, but that's something that I do when I'm in that situation. So those kinds of things, that you do. So Dogen says, he admonishes us in this text. He says, you should pay attention and respect all things and beings. So how do we engage with our environment? And in Tenzo Kyokon, he's talking about respecting a piece of lettuce, as the Buddha, the head of a Buddha, and, treating lettuce like the Buddha's head. And he says, don't discard vegetables because you think they don't look quite up to snuff, that we really respect each thing that we run across. But in our case, we might think that, of course, applies to us, but also, how do we engage with our environment? What, do we heedlessly use plastic? How do we take care of our clothes? Do we carefully and respectfully wash our dishes, pots and pans, things like that, just in our daily lives that we kind of take for granted, that we relate to them with respect and gratitude. He writes in Tenzo Kyokon, he says, clean with equal care and awareness, putting everything back where it belongs, keep your mind on the work and do not throw things around. So you might think to yourself, well, do I throw things around? But I remember at Tassajara, we would be in the kitchen and people would take metal spoons on the edge of a pot or something and bang them on the pot to get food off of the spoon. That is throwing things around. It's like, how do you relate to the objects in your experience? When you are like writing or something and you stop writing, do you drop your pen like from here down to the table, or do you set it on the table? That kind of thing, like finishing actions, paying attention, finishing relationships with other people, that kind of thing, letting them finish. I'm really bad about interrupting Jaku when she's talking to me, so I need to pay attention to letting her finish And that's kind of like not dropping the pen, paying attention to these relationships. It's very, very important. And Dogen says that we should abide in the Dharma gate of practice and calm and focus our minds. So here's what Dogen says about our minds. He says, our minds go racing around like horses running wild in the fields, while our emotions remain unmanageable like monkeys swinging in the trees. He said, if we step back and reflect on our lives or our work and not lose sight of either the absolute or the practical. He says to step back, reflect on our lives with our work, and not lose sight of either the absolute or the practical. So paying attention to the practical is this effort that we're making to put pens down on the table, letting everyone finish their sentences, really paying attention to and completing listening, completing an action, and being respectful of all beings and all things. And so that would be paying attention to the practical, but on the other hand, not losing sight of the absolute is to remember that we're not different, to remember that we are all in this together, to remember that, and I'm not talking about being merged in the case of me interrupting Jaku, but in the case of, really respecting each other and really seeing that respect is generated because when we feel some kind of aversion arising with another person, and usually that's where we have problems with another person, is to remember that we are not different and that start there. Or in the example, if I gave the example of picking up paper towels off the floor in the bathroom, you might think to yourself, ew, there's germs on the bathroom floor, people go to the bathroom in there, etc. But in a way, it's like that paper is not different from me. That paper deserves my respect to pick it up. I can always wash my hands. It's like I don't have to immediately pick something up like that and stick my hand up like this and start rubbing my eye. I can wash my hands. And my hands do really well with washing. It's amazing how well that works. So to think about that. And so not losing sight of the absolute. And then Dogen ends Tenzo Kyokan, which is about, I don't know, a 15-page essay in English. So I've only skimmed over little parts of it. So he ends it by talking about cultivating the mind of joy, the parental mind, and magnanimous mind. So this mind of joy is that we cultivate gratitude. And in Kuge, he talks about Kuge, which is Flowers of Emptiness. It's a fascicle in Shobogenzo. He talks about sitting in the fire of the blue lotus, and I love this image, as bodhisattvas sitting in the fire of samsara. The only reason that we need bodhisattva practice, whether it's Theravada practice or whoever is engaged in this, whatever label we want to put on it, the only reason to do this is because we need to sit in the fire because samsara is happening, suffering is happening. If there was no suffering, if there were no problems, why would we do this practice? It wouldn't occur to us because we wouldn't need to do the practice. But because of the suffering of self and others, we need to cultivate these minds of equanimity, right? We need to cultivate wisdom, because we need to be able to respond to our own difficulties and the difficulties of others with wisdom and compassion. Otherwise, why would we do it? I mean, it wouldn't even occur to us because we wouldn't need to do it because everything would be great. There'd be no suffering at all. But there is. And so we sit in the fire of the blue lotus. Whether you want to sit in the fire of the blue lotus or not, guess what? We're sitting in the fire of the blue lotus. So what are we going to do? Are we going to be bodhisattvas sitting in the fire of blue lotus? Are we going to be something else sitting in the fire of the blue lotus? So we want to be, I assume we're all co-natals, right? I assume that we, as bodhisattvas, we want to sit in the fire of the blue lotus together and figure out how we can help alleviate the suffering of self and others with each other through this practice. So one of this is creating this mind of joy, this willingness to keep our heads in the midst of our difficulties and to cultivate gratitude, which is very helpful. If you're worried about the election in November, it's really helpful to keep a mind of equanimity. It's really helpful to focus your mind and create joy and gratitude for things that are going well, so that as we have to cope with whatever may happen in the future, our own fears about whatever may happen in the future, that we actually are able to be present for our lives. So we do this with a mind of what is needed in this situation, not necessarily what is demanded of us. Okay, so this isn't about going out and tearing yourself to pieces, doing things that are unwholesome or unhealthy. And it isn't about fantasizing about what we think is the best thing to do, but actually listening to our present life and asking ourselves what is the best thing to do, meeting our life at this moment. And then Dogen says a parental mind. So parental mind is this mind, the mature mind of being the mind of the parent. And in Western culture, maybe sometimes we're not so happy about our parents, but this mature mind of wanting to get back, returning to the marketplace with gift bestowing hands. This is the parental mind. This is the mind of wanting to be the mature person in the room, the mind of wanting to be helpful and not be selfish. That's the parental mind. And then finally, there's magnanimous mind. And this Dogen uses the image of a mountain. He says it's a very stable mind, like a mountain. So it's the opposite of the horses running wild or the monkeys swinging around in the trees. It's this whoomp, sitting zazen is like mountain. Ideally, you're like a mountain. You're like, you're here, having this mind of cultivating the mind of equanimity, cultivating this very stable mind. So we begin practice by supporting and paying attention to our own minds. And that means not being critical of other people and not making comparisons with other people because each one of us has our own personality, things that we need to work on. And it's not helpful to criticize ourselves. And it's not helpful when we do this practice to compare ourselves to somebody else who we don't really know their minds. So it's just not helpful to engage in that kind of activity. So we do what we can to stabilize our mind and to help others. And it's kind of like being on a 2-lane highway. So it's not like, you're going along and you're completely screwed up, monkey in the tree, crazy horse mind. And then all of a sudden you switch over to the other lane at some point in the future and you're wise. Most of us are sometimes crazy, sometimes wise, right? So most of us are like kind of going back and forth on this 2-lane road between wisdom and compassion and skillful means to not so wise, not so compassionate, selfish, not very skillful. And then we learn from that. And if we're willing to not blame others and to actually look at our own behavior in a way that's not defensive and not harmful to ourselves, that brain that says, oh, you're terrible, you've always been terrible, you're never going to get this together. We don't need that brain. We don't need that mindset. Think of it as just a problem. That didn't work. I got to go back and apologize or mend my ways or something. That wasn't very workable. So how do I go forward having screwed this up essentially and do a better job? And so that's part of that, going along that 2-lane road and, the freeway with the 2 lanes. And so, that's our practice, to carry this self forward as delusion, to allow myriad things to come forth through the self as a realization. To study the self is to know the self. To know the self is to forget the self. So this is this process that Dogen talks about in Gensho Koan. So, sometimes we fall down, we can't reach our goals. Sometimes we do okay. Sometimes we do absolutely stellar. But it's our mandate in this practice to engage in this bodhisattva effort, to engage in this effort to wake up our bodhisattva mind. So that's Hotai, right? Number 10. is waking up this bodhisattva mind and going back to the marketplace. I don't, you can think of, as we talked about before, you can, think of these pictures here. I think, the first picture, the seeking and the running around with the whip and the noose in number 2, and number 3, just glimpsing the ox, and number 4, catching the ox. I think, by the time we get to number 4 and 5, we're kind of hooked. There's this way in practice where you've been doing it long enough that you're not going to stop practicing. It's like you're pretty much baked in at that point. So then it's like all these other pictures are about, how do we mature in practice? How do we figure out intellectually, emotionally, non-intellectually, intuitively, all the various ways we can talk about this. How do we actually engage and do the practice? And so that's what all the other pictures are about. And sometimes we're number 10 and sometimes we're not. And sometimes we're, number 6, and sometimes we're number 7 or number 5 or number 4. But all of us, no matter which one of these pictures we are, all of us are having this aspiration to be number 10. And that number 10 arises at different times. Sometimes we know it, sometimes we don't. And so we should, never disparage our practice, just keep making our effort as best we can. Thank you very much.